The quiet town of Willow Creek, Colorado, was the kind of place where life moved at a gentle pace. Nestled between rolling hills and thick forests, it was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where neighbors exchanged friendly waves from their porches, and where the biggest excitement was the annual summer fair. It was safe, predictable, and peaceful, at least on the surface. But beneath that warmth lay an unspoken rule. Some things didn't belong. And for many in the community, pit bulls were one of them. Emily Brooks had heard the whispers before, the stories passed around by adults when they thought no children were listening. She had overheard her father, Daniel, talk about how dangerous they could be, how unpredictable. But Emily wasn't so sure. She had never actually met a pit bull before. In fact, she had never had a dog of her own, though she had always wanted one. She loved animals. Her bookshelves were lined with stories about brave dogs and loyal companions. But her father had always said no. Daniel Brooks was a man of discipline. As a police officer, he had seen enough in his years on the force to make him cautious. He wasn't an unkind man, far from it. He adored Emily, and everything he did was to protect her. But experience had shaped his beliefs, and one particular incident from years ago had left him wary of certain dog breeds. He never talked about it, but Emily knew enough to understand that his distrust ran deep. Emily's grandmother, Martha, was the bridge between them. At 65, she had a warmth about her that made everyone feel at home. She was patient and understanding, always encouraging Emily's love for animals while respecting Daniel's concerns. But even Martha had her limits when it came to safety. Then there was Josh Carter, their neighbor. He was a veterinarian who had seen too many abandoned pit bulls over the years. Some had been mistreated. Others simply misunderstood. He knew better than most that these dogs weren't monsters, but he also knew how hard it was to change people's minds. None of them knew that one seemingly ordinary afternoon would change everything. It started as a normal school day. Emily, with her backpack slung over her shoulder, took her usual route home, enjoying the crisp autumn air. The sidewalks were littered with golden leaves, crunching beneath her sneakers as she walked. She was in no hurry. Her father wouldn't be home until later, and her grandmother would be busy knitting or watching one of her favorite old movies. As she turned the corner near an abandoned lot, something caught her eye. A shape, unmoving, near the edge of the road. At first she thought it was a pile of rags discarded and forgotten, but then it moved. Emily froze. It was a dog, a big one. Her heart pounded as she took a hesitant step closer. The dog's fur, once a beautiful silver gray, was now matted with dirt. Its ribs were visible beneath its skin, its body thin and frail. But it was the eyes that stopped her. They weren't wild or threatening. They were tired, worn. But deep inside them there was something else, something that looked an awful lot like hope. The dog didn't move much, just flicked its ears at her presence. It didn't growl or bare its teeth, but it also didn't wag its tail. It just watched. Emily knew she should keep walking. She had been told 100 times not to approach strange dogs, especially ones that looked like this. But something about this one made her hesitate. It looked lost. Slowly, carefully, she reached into her backpack. Her fingers brushed against the plastic container holding the remains of her lunch, a ham and cheese sandwich she hadn't finished at school. Without thinking too much, she unwrapped it, crouched down, and placed it on the ground a few feet away from the dog. She backed up quickly, giving it space. For a long moment, the dog didn't move. It just stared at the sandwich, as if trying to decide whether it was real or some kind of cruel trick. Then, cautiously, it inched forward. Emily held her breath, watching as it lowered its nose, sniffing the food tentatively. Then, in one quick motion, it grabbed the sandwich and devoured it. But even as it ate, its eyes never left her. Emily felt a strange tightness in her chest. The dog was starving, that much was clear. But it wasn't just hunger that made it hesitate. It was something else. Fear, maybe. Distrust. as if it had learned the hard way that kindness didn't always come without a cost. She wanted to do more, to say something. But what could she say to a dog that had clearly been through so much? So instead, she simply whispered, "It's okay." The dog's ears twitched, but it didn't move. Emily took one step back, then another. She didn't want to scare it. Then, with one last glance, she turned and walked away, her heart heavy. She didn't look back, afraid that if she did, she would see those sad eyes again and feel even more helpless. She didn't know that the dog was still watching her long after she had disappeared from sight, and she certainly didn't know that by morning it would be sitting on her front porch, waiting for her. Emily woke to the soft golden light filtering through her curtains, the early morning stillness filling the house. She stretched, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and for a moment she had almost forgotten about the dog she had fed the day before. Almost. A strange feeling sat in her chest, an odd mixture of worry and curiosity. Had the dog found another place to rest? Had it wandered off in search of more food? Something inside her hoped she would see it again, though she knew the chances were slim. Slipping out of bed, she tiptoed through the quiet house. Her grandmother was already in the kitchen, the familiar scent of coffee in the air. Emily gave her a sleepy smile before heading toward the front door. The floorboards creaked under her feet as she reached for the doorknob, twisting it slowly. The moment she pulled the door open, she gasped. Sitting on the porch, curled up against the wooden railing, was the same silver-gray pit bull from yesterday. It wasn't just passing by. It wasn't searching for scraps in the garbage. It was waiting. Emily's heart pounded as she took a hesitant step forward. The dog lifted its head, ears twitching, but made no move to run. Its golden brown eyes locked onto hers, filled with something that looked like quiet longing. "You're back," she whispered, hardly believing it. The dog didn't wag its tail. It didn't leap up excitedly. It simply watched her, silent and still, as if waiting for her next move. Emily wasn't sure what to do. She had never taken care of a dog before, let alone one that had clearly been through so much. She could still see its ribs beneath its short, dusty fur, the signs of exhaustion in the way it held itself. But it had chosen to come back to her. That had to mean something. Behind her, the sound of shuffling footsteps pulled her out of her thoughts. "Emily? What are you doing out here?" Emily turned to see her grandmother standing in the doorway, her robe pulled tightly around her, a concerned expression on her face. When her gaze landed on the dog, her brows knitted together. "Grandma, it's him," Emily said softly. "The dog I told you about. He came back." Martha frowned, stepping closer but keeping a safe distance. She studied the dog, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Sweetheart, we don't know anything about this dog. He could be sick. He could be dangerous." Emily's stomach twisted. She knew her grandmother wasn't being unkind. She was just being cautious. But looking at the pit bull's quiet, expectant gaze, Emily didn't see danger. She saw loneliness. "I don't think he's dangerous," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's just lost." Martha sighed, rubbing her temples. "Emily, your father will be home soon. You know how he feels about dogs like this." Emily's chest tightened. She did know. And that was what worried her most. "Please, Grandma," she pleaded. "Just let him stay for a little while, just until we figure out what to do." Her grandmother hesitated, glancing at the dog once more. It hadn't moved, hadn't even made a sound. It just sat there, as if it understood that its fate was being decided in this very moment. Martha sighed again, softer this time. "All right," she relented. "But only for now, and he stays outside." Relief flooded through Emily. "Thank you," she said, turning back to the dog. The pit bull still hadn't moved, but his eyes flicked between Emily and her grandmother, as if sensing the silent battle that had just taken place. Emily sat down on the porch steps, keeping a careful distance. "We need to call you something," she murmured. She thought back to the way he had hesitated yesterday, the way he had been so careful, yet so desperate for help. Titan. The name came to her suddenly, unexplainably. Titan, she tried, testing the sound of it. The dog didn't react immediately, but after a moment, his ears twitched ever so slightly. A small flicker of recognition, or maybe just curiosity. Either way, Emily smiled. "That's what I'll call you," she decided. Titan. But just as the morning air felt a little lighter, the sound of tires crunching over gravel sent a wave of dread through Emily's chest. Her father was home. Daniel Brooks stepped out of his patrol car, his uniform still crisp despite the long hours he had likely worked the night before. He looked tired, but when his eyes landed on the dog sitting at the front porch, all exhaustion vanished, replaced by something much sharper. "Emily," he said, his voice edged with disbelief. "What is that doing here?" Emily swallowed hard, standing up quickly. Titan flinched at the change in tone but remained where he was. "He came back," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I fed him yesterday, and this morning he was just here." Daniel's jaw tightened as he walked closer, his entire posture rigid. His eyes flicked between Titan and Emily could practically hear his unspoken thoughts. "You need to get away from it," he said firmly. Emily's heart squeezed. "Dad, he's not—" "He's a pit bull, Emily." Daniel's voice was sharp, final. "You know what I've told you about these dogs." Emily knew arguing wouldn't help, but she had to try. "He's not aggressive," she insisted. "He's scared. He hasn't done anything wrong." Daniel turned to Martha. "Mom, why is there a stray dog on our porch?" Martha sighed. "Emily wanted to help him. I told her he could stay outside just for now." Daniel shook his head, frustration clear in his expression. "Number? Absolutely not. This is not safe. We don't know where he came from, what he's been through." Emily's throat burned. "Please, Dad, just for one night." Silence stretched between them. Finally, with a heavy sigh, Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "One night," he muttered, "but he stays outside, and tomorrow we're figuring out what to do with him." Emily exhaled shakily, glancing down at Titan. The dog hadn't moved, but something about the way he watched her made her think he understood. One night. It wasn't much, but it was something. The morning sun had barely risen over Willow Creek when the whispers began to spread. By midday, nearly everyone in the neighborhood knew about the pit bull on the Brooks porch. It didn't take long for concerned glances to turn into hushed conversations, and soon the rumors became louder than the truth. Emily could hear the murmurs even before she stepped outside. As she and Titan sat on the porch, she noticed Mrs. Lawson, the elderly woman who lived 2 houses down, watching them from behind her curtains. A few houses over, Mr. Turner, who prided himself on keeping the neighborhood safe, had already started making his rounds, talking in low voices with the other residents. She didn't need to hear them to know what they were saying. It was only a matter of time before someone took their concerns directly to her father. By the time Daniel came home that evening, his expression was a mixture of exhaustion and irritation. "Emily," he called out as he stepped from his car, glancing at Titan, who was lying at the foot of the porch steps. "We need to talk." Emily's stomach tightened. She had been expecting this. Her father sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as he walked up the steps. "The neighbors aren't happy. I had 3 different people tell me today that they're worried about you keeping that dog." Emily's hands curled into fists. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel exhaled. "Because, Emily, he's a pit bull. People don't trust them. That's not fair," she shot back. "Titan hasn't done anything wrong." "I know that," Daniel said carefully, But they don't. Mrs. Lawson had warned him that she wouldn't feel safe walking past his house anymore. Mr. Turner had gone so far as to suggest calling animal control, convinced that keeping a stray pit bull around was asking for trouble. Emily felt heat rise in her cheeks. He's not dangerous. He doesn't even bark at people. Daniel gave her a long, unreadable look before shaking his head. I told you he could stay one night. That was yesterday. Emily's heart clenched. Dad, please. Just a little longer. Before Daniel could answer, Titan lifted his head, his ears perking up at the sound of voices from down the street. Emily followed his gaze and saw a small group of kids gathered near the sidewalk, whispering among themselves. She recognized them, Caleb and his friends, boys from school who liked to stir up trouble. And judging by the way Caleb bent down to pick up something from the ground, she had a terrible feeling about what was coming next. A second later, a small rock sailed through the air. It landed just a few inches from Titan's front paws. Emily shot up from her seat. Hey, stop it! Caleb and his friends only laughed. Another rock followed, this one landing even closer. Titan flinched, shrinking back slightly, his tail tucking under his body. But he didn't growl, didn't lunge, didn't fight back. He just sat there, still and wary, his golden brown eyes darting between Emily and the boys. Daniel stepped forward, his expression darkening. That's enough, he said in a firm voice that made Caleb and the others freeze. Get home, now. The boys hesitated before turning and running off, their laughter fading into the distance. Emily's hands trembled as she looked back at Titan. He had curled himself into a tight ball, his body tense as if expecting another attack. Her chest tightened. He was used to this, to being treated like a monster, to being afraid. She knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his back. It's okay, she murmured. They're gone. Titan didn't move at first, but after a few seconds, he let out a slow breath and leaned into her touch. Daniel watched in silence, something shifting in his gaze. He didn't say another word about the neighbors or Titan leaving. Instead, he simply turned and went inside. But Emily knew the battle was far from over. That night, the air was crisp and cool, carrying the distant hum of crickets through the backyard. Emily had just stepped outside to get some fresh air when she noticed Titan stiffen beside her. His ears perked, his muscles tensed. Then he let out a low, warning growl. Emily followed his gaze toward the driveway, and that's when she saw him. A shadowy figure crouched beside her father's car. Her breath hitched. Someone was trying to break in. The stranger fumbled with the car door handle, clearly unaware that he was being watched. Emily's pulse pounded. She should run inside, call for her dad. But before she could move, Titan stepped forward, placing himself between her and the intruder. The growl deepened, rumbling low in his throat. But he didn't charge, didn't attack. He simply stood firm, his stance protective, waiting. The intruder froze, turning his head slightly. Emily caught a glimpse of his face, a man in his late 20s, wearing a hoodie pulled low over his eyes. For a moment there was silence. Then Titan let out a booming bark. It was loud, louder than Emily had ever heard him before. The sound shattered the stillness, ringing through the night like an alarm. The man jerked back, startled, and then took off running. Titan barked again, this time chasing him halfway down the yard before stopping. He didn't chase him further, didn't bite. He simply stood his ground, making sure the threat was gone. Emily was still frozen in place when the porch light flicked on. Emily, what's going on? Daniel's voice was sharp as he stepped outside, his hand instinctively moving toward his holster. By the time he saw the empty driveway and Titan standing alert, Emily had found her voice. There was a man, she stammered. He was trying to break into your car. Daniel's expression darkened. His eyes swept the area before landing on Titan. Emily expected him to be upset, to tell her she should have come inside immediately. But instead, he just stood there, his gaze flicking between the dog and the driveway. Titan turned his head toward Daniel, and for the first time they locked eyes, and something passed between them. Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "He scared him off?" he asked, his voice quieter. Emily nodded. A long pause stretched between them before Daniel finally sighed. "Go inside, Emily. I'll check the area." She hesitated before obeying, glancing back at Titan before heading up the porch steps. The pit bull followed close behind, his head held high despite the tension still lingering in his body. For the first time since Titan had arrived, Daniel didn't tell her to keep the dog outside. He didn't say anything at all. But Emily saw the way he looked at Titan, and she knew. Something had changed. The days following the break-in were different. The atmosphere in the Brooks household had shifted, subtly, but unmistakably. Daniel still didn't say much about Titan, but he no longer protested his presence. In fact, when Emily woke up early one morning to check on the dog, she found her father already outside, watching him. Titan had changed, too. He no longer flinched at sudden sounds as much, and he had started following Emily around the yard, his cautious eyes softening whenever she spoke to him. There was trust growing between them, slow but steady. Still, there were unanswered questions about where Titan had come from, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that his past was much darker than she had initially thought. That was when Josh Carter decided to help. Josh had always been a quiet presence in the neighborhood, approachable but never intrusive. As a veterinarian, he had seen his fair share of abandoned and mistreated animals, and something about Titan had raised red flags from the moment he saw him. It wasn't just the scars on the dog's body or the way he reacted to loud noises. It was his discipline, the way he obeyed commands that no one had taught him, how he held himself with the rigid stillness of a dog who had been trained to expect orders. It made Josh wonder, who had trained him, and for what? "I think we should scan him for a microchip," Josh suggested one afternoon while visiting the Brooks home. He pulled a small handheld device from his bag and powered it on. Emily looked at Titan, sitting calmly beside her. "Will it hurt him?" she asked. Josh smiled. "Not at all. It's just like scanning groceries at a store." Daniel crossed his arms, watching skeptically. "And what exactly are you hoping to find?" Josh hesitated before answering. "Maybe nothing. But if there's a chip, it might tell us where he came from." Emily glanced at her father, silently pleading for his approval. After a moment, Daniel exhaled and nodded. Titan didn't resist as Josh ran the scanner over his shoulder blades, moving it slowly across his fur. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, a faint beep sounded. Emily's heart skipped a beat. "There's a chip," Josh confirmed. Emily leaned in closer. "So now what?" Josh studied the small screen. "It has a registered ID, but some of the information is missing. Either it wasn't properly updated or—" He hesitated. "Or someone tried to erase it." Daniel's expression darkened. "Why would someone erase a microchip?" Josh shook his head. "That's what I'd like to find out." He jotted down the partial registration number and promised to make a few calls. If Titan had an owner, or someone who had used him for something he shouldn't have been a part of, Josh would try to track them down. Emily hoped the results would be harmless, that maybe Titan had once been part of a family that had lost him, that maybe they would find a kind-hearted person looking for him. But the truth was far from what she had imagined. Josh's call came 3 days later. Emily had been playing with Titan in the backyard when her grandmother called her inside. She found Josh and her father sitting at the kitchen table, their expressions serious. "We found something," Josh said. Emily's stomach twisted. "What?" Josh set his phone on the table, tapping the screen to pull up an email. "Titan was originally registered under a training facility in a different county. But here's where it gets complicated. His registration was flagged." Daniel leaned forward. "Flagged for what?" Josh hesitated. "The facility was shut down about a year ago for illegal activities." "Dogfighting." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "No, she whispered, shaking her head. Not Titan. Josh's voice softened. I don't think he was ever used for fighting, Emily, but he was likely bred and trained for it. Emily looked down at Titan, who sat obediently at her feet, his golden eyes looking up at her with unwavering loyalty. She felt sick. I don't understand, she said. If he was trained for that, why is he so gentle? Josh sighed. Not all dogs used in those operations are fighters. Some are trained as bait dogs, others as guards. Some, like Titan, may have been trained but never forced to fight. It's possible he escaped before they could use him. Emily swallowed hard. Escaped. That explained the scars, the fear, the hesitation around strangers. Daniel's jaw clenched. Do we know who ran the place? Josh shook his head. Most of the operation was dismantled, but there was someone involved, someone who might be looking for him. The room fell silent. Emily instinctively pulled Titan closer. What do you mean? She asked quietly. Josh hesitated before saying, There's been a man asking around town about a gray pit bull. Emily felt her heart stop. Daniel sat up straighter. Who? Josh glanced at Daniel before answering. His name is Ethan Morris. He was linked to a few of these underground kennels but never officially charged with anything. Word is he's been in town for a couple of days. Emily felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Daniel's eyes darkened. You think he's looking for Titan? Josh nodded. It's possible. Emily looked at Titan again, this time with a new understanding. He had run away from something terrible, had escaped a life no dog should have to live. And now, someone from that past wanted him back. We can't let him take Titan, she said firmly. Daniel sighed. We don't know for sure that he has any legal claim. If there's no official record linking him to Titan, then he's just another guy looking for a dog. Josh nodded. That's true, but we need to be careful. If he thinks Titan belongs to him, he might not care about the law. Emily's chest tightened. Titan had barely begun to heal, to feel safe. She couldn't let someone take him away, not now, not ever. Have you seen him? Daniel asked Josh. Josh nodded grimly. Once, he came into my clinic asking questions, said he was looking for a lost dog. But the way he asked, he wasn't just looking for any dog. He was looking for this dog. Daniel's fists clenched. Did you tell him anything? Josh shook his head. Of course not, but it's only a matter of time before he figures out Titan is here. Emily felt fear grip her, but when she looked at Titan, she saw calmness. He didn't know what was happening. He only knew that for the first time, he had a home. We have to do something, she insisted. Daniel sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He was silent for a long moment before finally saying, We protect him, no matter what. Emily felt a lump rise in her throat, but she nodded, tightening her arms around Titan's neck. For the first time in his life, Titan wasn't running anymore, but they had no idea what Ethan Morris would do next, and how far he would go to take Titan back. The morning air was thick with tension, the kind that made the entire house feel suffocating. Emily sat on the living room floor, one hand tangled in Titan's fur, the other gripping the edge of her sweater. She could hear her father's voice in the next room, low and sharp, carrying the unmistakable weight of an argument. She knew what this was about. Ethan had come. It had been 3 days since Josh uncovered the truth about Titan's past. 3 days since Emily learned that the dog she loved had once belonged to a world of cruelty. But Titan had escaped that life. He had chosen freedom. And now, Ethan Morris wanted him back. The front door creaked open, and Emily's stomach clenched. Titan lifted his head, ears twitching as footsteps echoed against the wooden floor. Then a voice she had never heard before rang through the house. Where is he? Emily sucked in a sharp breath. She turned toward the doorway just as Ethan Morris stepped into view. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with a rough, weathered face that looked like it had seen its fair share of fights. His dark eyes scanned the room with cold calculation, finally landing on Titan. "There you are," Ethan muttered, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Titan went rigid beside Emily. His ears flattened, his muscles tensed, not out of excitement but fear. Emily felt his body press closer to hers, as if seeking comfort. That was all she needed to see. She shot to her feet, arms spreading out instinctively in front of Titan. "You can't have him." Ethan's smirk faded. "Kid, that dog is mine." "No, he's not," Emily snapped. Daniel stepped forward, placing himself between them. His police officer's stance took over, firm, unyielding, protective. "You have no legal claim here," he said coolly. "Leave." Ethan let out a low chuckle. "Come on, officer. You know as well as I do that dogs like him don't just belong to anyone. He was trained, disciplined, and I paid for that training." Daniel's fists clenched. "You mean you forced him into it?" Ethan's expression darkened, but before he could respond, Josh entered the room holding a file in his hands. "We looked into you, Ethan," Josh said evenly. "Found more than a few connections between you and illegal kennels. You were never officially charged, but there are plenty of witness statements saying you were involved in dogfighting rings." Ethan's jaw tightened. "That's a load of—" Josh ignored him. "You lost Titan when the last kennel was raided, didn't you? That's why his microchip wasn't properly updated. You abandoned him and now you think you can just waltz in here and take him back?" Emily's hands balled into fists. "Titan's not going anywhere with you." Ethan's eyes flickered toward the dog. "Let's see about that." Then he did something that made Emily's blood run cold. He took a step forward, squared his shoulders, and in a sharp, commanding voice, he barked out an order. "Sit!" The word cut through the air like a whip, loud, forceful, demanding obedience. Emily's heart nearly stopped. For a split second, Titan flinched. His body stiffened. His head lowering slightly like an old instinct was pulling at him, trying to drag him back to the life he had escaped. Ethan's smirk returned. "See? He knows who his real master is." Emily's throat tightened. "Number, please, Titan, don't listen to him." Then Ethan gave the next command. "Come!" Titan didn't move. Ethan's smirk faltered. "Come!" Titan's ears flicked. His body trembled slightly, but he didn't step forward. Instead, he took a step back, then another, until finally he pressed himself firmly against Emily's legs, his golden eyes flicking up to her with quiet resolve. Emily let out a shaky breath. He had made his choice. A flicker of something dangerous flashed through Ethan's eyes. His lips pressed into a thin line. "You little mutt," he growled under his breath. Daniel stepped forward in an instant, voice sharp. "I'd suggest you leave now before I make this official." Ethan scoffed. "You don't get it, do you? Dogs like him don't just change." His gaze flickered toward Titan. "You think he's safe? You think you can trust him? He'll snap one day, and when he does, you'll wish you had listened to me." Emily saw red. "You don't know anything about him." Ethan let out a cold laugh. "I know he was bred to fight. I know he was trained to obey, and I know deep down he'll always be that dog." Emily's hands shook with anger. "No," she said through clenched teeth. "Titan isn't who you made him to be. He's who he chooses to be." Titan growled lowly, stepping forward, not toward Ethan but in front of Emily, defending her, protecting her. Ethan stared at the dog, a muscle in his jaw ticking. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and stalked toward the door. But just before stepping outside, he threw a look over his shoulder. "This isn't over," he warned. Then, he was gone. The moment the door slammed shut, Emily collapsed to her knees, wrapping her arms around Titan's thick neck. Her breath was shaky, her entire body trembling. Titan let out a small huff and pressed his head against her shoulder, offering silent reassurance. Daniel exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand down his face. "That man is trouble," he muttered. Josh nodded grimly. "We should assume he'll try again." Martha, who had been standing in the hallway, finally spoke. "So what do we do now?" Emily tightened her grip around Titan. "We fight for him." Daniel looked down at his daughter, at the way Titan stayed close to her. His body language relaxed, despite the tension that had filled the room just moments ago. Finally, he nodded. "We protect him," Daniel said, voice firm. "No matter what." Emily felt a surge of hope. Titan had made his choice. Now it was up to them to make sure no one ever took it away from him again. The days following Ethan's confrontation were filled with tension, but also determination. The Brooks family knew Ethan wouldn't simply walk away from Titan. He had made a threat, and Daniel wasn't about to take it lightly. What Ethan hadn't counted on, however, was that he had underestimated the people standing in his way. Daniel and Josh wasted no time. Using the partial registration from Titan's microchip and the information they had gathered about Ethan's past involvement with illegal kennels, they started compiling a case against him. Josh reached out to old veterinary contacts, searching for any documentation linking Ethan to unethical dog training and underground operations. Meanwhile, Daniel called in a favor with a few trusted officers in a neighboring county. Officers who hadn't forgotten the last time Ethan had slipped through the cracks. The more they dug, the more the pieces came together. They found witness reports, old police records, complaints about a man matching Ethan's description who had been seen with mistreated dogs. It was enough for Daniel to bring to the authorities. And then they got the call. Ethan had been arrested. It happened early in the morning. A raid on a warehouse just outside town uncovered clear evidence of animal abuse, training equipment used for underground fights, unregistered dogs in poor condition, and, most damning of all, financial records linking Ethan to known operations. When Daniel returned home that evening, his expression was unreadable. Emily rushed to his side the moment he stepped through the door. "What happened?" Daniel exhaled, setting his badge and gun on the table. "They got him!" Emily's heart leapt. "For real?" "For real," Daniel confirmed. "Ethan won't be coming back." Emily felt a flood of relief rush through her. She turned to Titan, who sat patiently by the door, his golden eyes fixed on her. "Did you hear that, buddy?" she whispered, kneeling down beside him. "You're safe now." Titan didn't understand the words, but somehow he knew. He leaned into her touch, his large head resting against her shoulder. Daniel watched the interaction, something softening in his expression. He had spent so much time fearing what Titan represented, his past experiences with the breed, the reputation pit bulls carried. But now he saw the truth right in front of him. Titan wasn't dangerous. Titan was family. Titan's new beginning. The shift in Daniel's attitude didn't happen overnight, but it was real. At first, it was small things, letting Titan inside during colder nights, scratching behind his ears absent-mindedly when he walked by. But then, one morning, something happened that Emily never expected. Daniel brought out the training gear. Emily had seen it before. Old police training manuals, equipment Daniel had used when he worked with K-9 units early in his career. "Come on, Titan," Daniel called, holding out a treat. Emily froze. Titan perked up. For a moment, she thought the dog would hesitate, still haunted by the orders Ethan had barked at him before. But then, Titan's ears flicked forward, his tail wagged, and, for the first time ever, he followed Daniel without fear. Emily watched in awe as her father and Titan worked together. Daniel started with basic commands: sit, stay, heel. Titan obeyed each one without hesitation, eager to please. But it was different this time. There was no fear in his movements, no expectation of pain. This wasn't training out of obedience or survival. This was trust. After a few minutes, Daniel turned to Emily, tossing her a leash. "Your turn." Emily grinned. Training Titan became their new routine. Every morning before school, every evening after dinner, Emily and Daniel worked together, teaching Titan not just to obey, but to thrive. The bond between Titan and Daniel grew stronger each day. Emily still remembered the first night Titan had arrived, how her father had refused to let him inside, how he had warned her about keeping a pit bull. Now Daniel was the one who brought home a brand new dog bed for Titan. "He deserves a proper spot," he had muttered, setting it up in the living room. Emily had beamed so hard her face hurt. At first, the neighborhood was still wary. Mrs. Lawson still watched Titan with narrowed eyes. Mr. Turner still crossed the street whenever they passed by on walks. But then, something happened that no one expected. One day, as Emily walked Titan through the neighborhood, a little boy, no older than 5, tripped and fell on the sidewalk. Titan stopped immediately. Then he moved toward the child and gently nudged him back up with his nose. The boy giggled. His mother, standing nearby, had frozen in place. Emily held her breath, waiting for a reaction. And then, the mother smiled. "He's gentle," she murmured. Emily nodded eagerly. "He is." From that moment on, the walls started to come down. Neighbors who had once whispered about the dangerous pit bull started seeing him for who he really was, a protector, a survivor, a dog who had chosen kindness over fear, a family at last. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Emily turned to her father. "Do you think he knows?" she asked. Daniel glanced at her. "Knows what?" "That he's home now." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he looked down at Titan, resting peacefully by Emily's feet. He reached down, rubbing the dog's head. Titan sighed happily, nuzzling into his touch. "Yeah," Daniel said softly. "I think he knows." Emily smiled, leaning against her father's shoulder. Titan wasn't just a stray anymore. He was family. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the brook's front yard, Emily sat on the porch steps, Titan curled beside her. His once ragged coat now shone in the fading light. His golden eyes no longer wary, but full of warmth. He was home. She ran her fingers gently through his fur, remembering the day she had first seen him, dirty, wounded, and alone on the side of the road. Back then, she had only given him a simple sandwich, never realizing that one small act of kindness would change both of their lives forever. Titan had been feared, judged by his breed before anyone knew his heart. People had seen him as dangerous, but all he had ever wanted was to be loved. He wasn't a threat. He was a survivor, a dog who had endured cruelty and still chose to trust. And now, because of that trust, he had found a family. Her father, once so firm in his stance against pit bulls, had come to see the truth, that it wasn't the breed that made a dog dangerous, but the way it was treated. Daniel had once believed he was protecting his daughter by keeping Titan at a distance, but in the end, Titan was the one who had protected them all. Emily smiled as Titan nudged her hand, silently asking for another scratch behind his ears. "You're safe now," she whispered. Titan sighed contentedly, his tail thumping softly against the wooden porch. A simple sandwich had saved him. A single moment of kindness had changed everything. Because in the end, no act of kindness is ever wasted. And sometimes all it takes to heal a broken soul, whether human or animal, is a chance to be loved. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.